All right. Welcome everybody to our week six, right? It's week six session of our History of Newcastle seminar series. I hope everybody had a good break. I know it's been some time since we've had our traditional, it's been a few weeks since, 2 weeks, I think, since our last session here. So good to be back. I'd like to begin first by acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Pamalon clan of the Awabakal people and pay respect to their elders past and present. And it's my absolute pleasure today to welcome Dr. Julia Hamilton from the from Macquarie University. Julia has a history of strong research in Egyptology and teaching, intersecting with history, archaeology, and all sorts of interesting topics, as well as a fairly prestigious history of postdoctoral fellowships at Leiden, amongst other achievements, which I won't pull through her ego too much today. But for today, she's graciously come down the road to discuss with us a topic relating to our current teaching in Egypt, our AHIS 1050 class on the New Kingdom. So it's always nice to bring in experts on topics that we teach here. So today, Julia will be talking to us about coming to see the Temple of Djoser, making graffiti in ancient Memphis across 3 millennia and beyond. So without any further ado, I will pass it off to Julia. And thank you very much.
Let me just get myself set up here. Yeah, super. Because I don't need to.
Silly.
And the mouse.
There's a way to make that vanish.
No, that's okay. The mouse doesn't. Oh, it's a bit lagged. Okay, that's all right. That's all right. No worries. Just helpful for me knowing some history for people. So thank you, Brian. Kia ora koutou, ko Julia toka ingoa. I'm originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I've lived overseas for a really long time. I moved to Australia at the end of 2022, so I feel quite new here, and I actually love Newcastle. Like I love Newcastle, and in fact, I come to Newcastle quite often. So I was really, really delighted when Ryan invited me. So thank you, Ryan. I appreciate that, and your warm hospitality as well. Thank you. It's been a privilege to meet the students here as well. I'm really enjoying that, and it's a real privilege to also be invited to share my research with you. I also just want to acknowledge. Let's see if I can make this work. Can you hear me on Zoom? Can I get a Rebecca? Yeah. Okay. Good. Thanks. That's good to know. This.
Try clicking on it first and then.
Oh yeah, there we go. I just want to acknowledge the Pamalon clan of the Awabakal nation, as well, who've cared for country for thousands of years. Also acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded. And in this moment, also want to acknowledge the Walamadikal clan of the Darug nation, who are the custodians of the unceded lands, the fresh water of the Parramatta, where I teach and research at Macquarie University. This is a beautiful work by Durham and also studied at Macquarie University. This is good. So ancient Memphis, Saqqara's one of the modern names for this place, is saturated with graffiti, and this graffiti making practice stretches from the 3rd millennium BCE into the present day. So this is where the "and beyond" in the title comes from. It's really a tradition of epigraphic practice that stretches across an enormous time span. Graffiti are the material traces of people visiting places of worship here. I'll introduce some of that in this talk. And they're also intimately connected to the quotidian life of its metropolis and vast cemetery. So a very noisy, busy, and lively place of work. That's one of the things I want to emphasize in this talk. This landscape was under constant construction for several thousand years, and you don't necessarily get a sense of that now when you visit the site today. It's sort of static as a sort of cemetery site, but we need to imagine ancient Memphis as being just constantly moving and busy and loud, and graffiti sort of sits in that. Making graffiti makes a lot of sound. So my talk will address a series of questions and ideas that I hope resonate across some of the different disciplinary backgrounds that we all have. How people interact with monumental heritage over time, questions of literacy and social access to writing, some of the methodological challenges in documenting cut and carved and scratched inscriptions, so the graffiti literally, but also the politics of what gets preserved and studied by Egyptologists. So we're going to get in the car now. For those of you that haven't had the chance to visit Egypt, I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of what it's like traveling to this site where I work. So we're going to get in the car, we're going to speed literally 15 minutes south of modern day Cairo to the plateau that was traversed by these graffiti makers through these small villages, the houses here, rapid construction of new homes. This is a super busy road that takes us south from Cairo towards ancient Memphis or modern day Saqqara, and past thousands and thousands of date palms that cling to the cultivated and irrigated parts of the land adjacent to the Nile River. And then we leave that lush date palm situation by the river. In a few minutes, the landscape's completely different. It's dry and it's hot. It's really dusty. And the step pyramid of King Djoser, whose name is in the title of this talk, is this vast funerary structure that you can sort of see out of the car window there. And it really looms over the escarpment. In 2018, when I took this video, it was being stabilized and covered in wooden scaffolding, and that's what you can sort of see here. And actually, if you visit the site now, that's all gone because that process has been completed. So it's a really short drive by car, but it's about a 30-minute walk uphill from the sort of more lush part of the Nile. If you can imagine the sort of walk to work that some of these people might have had in ancient times, it's about 30 minutes. And today it's about 30 minutes from the ticket office to the car park also if you're walking. So we've now left the car park and we're walking up to this monumental structure. It's the step pyramid, one of the earliest stone monuments from Pharaonic Egypt that has this sort of super structured pyramidal shape. Across the courtyards on its eastern side. The pyramid and the ceremonial court, so you'll just have to believe me that this is a ceremonial court, was constructed around 2700 BCE. And an inscription that originally comes from the base of this statue shown here, which is now in the Cairo Museum, suggests that a man named Imhotep, who is named here in the Egyptian text, might have been the overseer of these works. This is in fact the only inscription from this period that connects Imhotep, quite famous figure and sort of popular culture now in the memory of Egypt. This is the only inscription from this time that actually connects Imhotep to this structure. We're going to walk past that ceremonial courtyard and towards this small chapel. This is the so-called Southern Pavilion, where just inside the door that you see in the centre, a number of painted inscriptions can be found. So some scholars would call these dipinti, it just means a painted inscription. And these date to around the 15th to 13th centuries BCE. In other words, well over 1,000 years after this monument was built. But this is still properly in the Pharaonic period, and this is what Egyptologists now call the New Kingdom. For students that are here, but students that might be watching this lecture a little bit later, this properly sits in the period that you're studying for your course. One of them is written by the treasury scribe, a man named Hednacht, and another scribe named Panacht, who came to see what they call the Temple of Djoser in the 47th year of the reign of King Ramesses II. And the inscription is quite long. I'll just give you a small excerpt of it. But the scribe of the treasury, Hednacht, has come to take a stroll and have a joyous time in the west of Memphis, together with his brother, the scribe of the vizier Panacht. And then he goes on to address the gods of Memphis, and he asks to be rewarded as a greatly praised one. This was a common formula for scribal compositions of this period, but it's not without elements of personalization. Many of the graffiti that I'm going to share with you in this talk are in fact not lengthy textual compositions like this one. This is actually quite unusual, but it's really famous, so I wanted to share it. And I think it's great for the students that are taking this New Kingdom Egypt course. If you're thinking about scribes and scribal culture, this is a really interesting text for you to think about as a primary source. I've also chosen it to open this lecture because it sets the scene so beautifully for some of the questions that underpin much of my research on graffiti. This was the subject of my postdoctoral research at Leiden University. What motivated Hednacht and Panacht to come to this particular place, or even this particular room? And what does that tell us about how ancient people adapted this landscape and all these buildings for their needs 1,000 years later, across such a vast span of time? The inscription tells us that coming to this place was pleasurable. right? It was a place to stroll or walk about. In Egyptian, the verb is sujud, and a place to enjoy, sajai here. People walked among ancient monuments that continued to have a salience in the lives of the living thousands of years after their construction. The painted inscription is actually quite low to the ground, so it's actually about 0.5 meters from the floor level, and it runs around a corner. That's what you can see here. Hanna Navratilova, one of my colleagues who is an expert in these New Kingdom inscriptions, has suggested that this is best explained as being made by someone who's actually sitting on the ground. So we kind of need to imagine Hednakt and Parnakt maybe squatting or sitting when they're making this inscription. And such a position would allow the writer to be making the inscription at eye height, roughly. Did the author misjudge the space on the wall when starting the first line, which is why it runs around the corner? Or did they just come a little more comfortable and so shifted position, and that explains the direction there? Or did it just not matter? These are all questions that we can ask that take us away from what the text says and more takes us into the realm of why are they writing this? How are they writing it? And what were the conditions of writing, which is something I'm really interested in. This asks us to put ourselves for a moment to the shoes or the sandals of these scribes standing before this massive pyramid, a monument that was not a few decades or a few generations older than themselves, but over 1,000 years older and belonging to a king whose name they still knew and still celebrated. For more than 3 millennia, this plateau west of the Nile has served as the main burial place for the inhabitants of the city of Memphis, Egypt's metropolis in the north, which is now archaeologically lost. We don't have the city really anymore. It's parts of it have come up in excavations around here, but it really lies under the modern villages that still exist in this place. It was an important cultic site for the breadth of pharaonic history, but also beyond that. So the early Christian sites there, like the monastery of St. Jeremiah or Upper Jeremiah, attest to its continual use and habitation and its significance as a religious site. Memphis, and this cemetery, was only really eclipsed in importance when the city of Fustat was founded in the 7th century CE, and this is now under modern Cairo. So Memphis was really important for nearly 4,000 years until Fustat was founded. The ancient Egyptians had many names for this place, but one of them is here Eminet Menefa, and this means an Egyptian on the west of Memphis. So that's what they call this area here. I know it's a bit laggy, but you need to imagine that all of this vast cemetery space here is what they call here Eminet Menefa, on the west of Memphis. So that's the time that Hednakt and Parnakt lived and worked. The place name brings the urban context of the cemetery into focus, remembering we've actually lost much of the urban context, and it emphasises that the site was viewed as a component of the lived urban environment. So Saqqara is actually still a place where people work and live. The workmen's village, or villages, which is down and along here, were built for the Egyptian archaeologists who were employed by British excavator Cecil Firth in the early 20th century. And these villages are actually still inhabited to this day by their descendants on the edge of the plateau. Here's where the and beyond part of the title comes in. At Saqqara, graffiti are attested in almost all of the major languages known to have been used by people who lived in Memphis during the course of its history. So we, of course, have Egypt's hieroglyphic and more cursive scripts. Much of my talk will focus on those scripts. I haven't included them here on the slide, but I wanted to share with you some of the other scripts that we have, of which graffiti are among them. So we have Greek and Coptic graffiti, which are abundant, some of which you see down here, especially in the environs of this monastery, which is now largely covered by sand. And to the north of the Serapeum, up here, a very famous site. Those of you familiar with Egypt's later and Ptolemaic history, there's a lot of activity here. And so we have a lot of Greek found in that area. We also have Phoenician and Aramaic, so one of the scripts related to Hebrew, which have been recorded at Abu Sir up here, and also in Dashur to the south. And these date from around the first half of the 5th century BCE. We also have Carian, which is a language of Western Anatolia, modern Turkey, which has been found in the animal catacombs in North Saqqara, so that's in this area around here. And then Arabic graffiti, which I show here, has been found also at the site as early as the 7th century CE, and this attests to visits made to structures which were still visible, especially in this area around the monastery. And then I don't have it on the slide, but actually we could also include the names and regiment numbers written in pencil by members of the Australian Imperial Force, possibly also some soldiers from Aotearoa, but they haven't yet been recorded. On the 12th of February 1915, in the Serapeum, the names of Benson, Gray, Davies, and Ellingworth. So we would add them to this slide here. I want to briefly give mention to the Arabic graffiti, even though I'm not going to focus on it for the rest of my talk. Arabic graffiti, both medieval and modern, because I think it has a really important life in this landscape, but it's as yet very, very poorly documented beyond passing mention in site reports. And so the prejudices of past excavators, which sometimes still carry into the present, have really actively contributed to this neglect of Arabic in our present scholarship. Graffiti were left by what were at the time called the so-called Arab destroyers of the 7th century CE, to quote British excavator James Keebel. But here we even know the names of these people. In this instance, as Keebel records it, in red ochre, the name Rashid. In fact, when the Islamic monuments of Cairo, like one that I show here on the slide, are very carefully studied, it becomes obvious there was a huge interest on the part of the builders and elite patrons of the city of Cairo or Fustat to repurpose valuable ancient stone from Memphis, something actually the ancient Egyptians themselves did at Memphis even as early as the 3rd millennium BCE. So this is hardly the work of destroyers, but rather people engaging in the same commemorative and recycling practices that the ancient Egyptians themselves had. The graffiti therefore seems to continue in this tradition that has existed since the Pharaonic period. It gives blessings, it sometimes requests a dedication. Usually the graffiti is a name and a date. A 17th century manuscript of unknown provenance, which is now in Paris, copied from an earlier work, records the monastery of Upper Jeremiah and the Tariq al-Ajil, the road of the bull nearby, which Okasha al-Dali suggests might be a reference to the ancient causeway for the Apis bull leading to the Serapeum, directly through and over the pyramid cemeteries located near Djoser's pyramid and the area that I work in now. So this is not yet work I've done, and I'm going to move on from this in a moment, but it would be a very exciting prospect to write a history of Memphis that reflected and synthesized all of this linguistic and cultural richness of the site that includes Arabic. Because graffiti, which is so poorly integrated into these histories of Islamic interest in the ancient Egyptian past, and this includes its hieroglyphic language, is a further source that attests this practice of visiting Memphis, to walk along these networks of paths and tracks. The growth of studying graffiti in Egyptology in more recent decades, and so my work sort of sits in this, I'm sort of past the 2010s, obviously, reflects the recognition of this being really integral to ancient Egyptian written visual culture, even though we don't really have an Egyptian word for it. So it really traces the historical development of the written script and the performance and the social display of writing through time. That's something I'll focus on at the end of my talk. Graffiti are found everywhere throughout Egypt. They act as a real map of human presence in the landscape. Quarries, mines, desert roads and their stops, temples and cemeteries like the ones at Memphis. Every single one of these places carries the mark of humans being there through their graffiti. The study of Pompeian graffiti, for those of you interested also in Pompeii, has served as a really important catalyst for Egyptologists adopting new methods and approaches for studying graffiti in Egypt. But the most recent research in the last 5 years or so has gradually moved towards a more integrated approach that actually considers this as an Egyptian phenomena and tries to set aside a distinction between, say, writing in terms of script and figural compositions, because the Egyptian language itself was highly pictorial and visual. So to sort of separate them as text and image doesn't actually really work for the Egyptian context. So that's sort of new work that is now being done. In Egyptology, graffiti, so Egyptologists, by the way, we have a tendency to adopt words from other disciplines and then kind of not use them like everybody else does. And graffiti is a really good example of this. So graffiti in Egyptology often describes scratched and painted inscriptions. You might have heard me use that word dipinti or dipinto earlier, which refers to a painted inscription. Egyptologists are sometimes a little bit sort of like whatever about these words, and so we just call everything graffiti, and that's a bit of a problem for those of us that are really interested in graffiti. As I said earlier, there's no Emic or Egyptian word that's known that to actually describe this type of script. Everything was just sort of writing. Some of it was more sacred or less sacred. So the definitions are quite tricky. Ancient Egyptian graffiti in the past has often been defined as being informal writings and drawings that are incised or scratched or painted on rocks, walls, or artifacts. But as I sort of showed you with the first example that I introduced this talk with, they can also be profoundly literary. They can be eloquent and scribal. They can in fact have the same purpose and function as dedicatory stelae in statues in temples or in other sacred spaces. But here's the rub. They also can share considerable overlap in their style and actually writer and character, and also sometimes authorship with other modes of written communication that are definitely not that sort of formal and eloquent and scribal. Some examples here on the slide include builders' inscriptions like masons' marks, hot marks, which are shown on the right. In many cases, graffiti basically can't be wrestled into one of these existing modern categories. The modern categories just don't really work here for us. What distinguishes graffiti from these other types of marks is that they are secondary. And so sometimes Egyptologists will call these secondary editions or secondary marks because they're being added to a surface or a monument, although we need to understand that that doesn't mean that they're of lesser importance. Figural graffiti have only rarely been integrated into the publication of individual monuments in Saqqara, and this is a silence in our publications that's really at odds with the situation on the ground. At worst, and this is a paper by my colleague Nico Starring, figural graffiti by Egyptologists is sometimes perceived as visual noise, obscuring the aesthetics of tomb or temple decoration, or even as mindless defacements or monuments. So the work that I'm and my colleagues are doing now in graffiti just in this place is really pushing back against this idea and trying to sort of set the graffiti in a broader frame. That's one of the goals. And just a quick fact before I move on from my colleague Nico's work. Bless you. Over 80% of the 243 graffiti which were studied in this paper, which is available freely online through the Museo Egizio website, over 80% of this graffiti is figural. So actually, if we're sort of excluding figural graffiti from our study, we're really missing a lot of what's happening in Memphis, and that really needs to change going forward. And now here we turn to some of my own work at Saqqara. Until pretty recently, there has actually been very little interest in graffiti on some of the most ancient monuments at Memphis. So the Pyramid of Djoser and monuments of around that period. This is a period that Egyptologists call the Old Kingdom. If you've heard that term before, it really refers to the period running from the reign of Djoser through to about 2200 BCE. So that's what I really work on in my research. The project of studying graffiti of this period for me is really slow burn, although I did have a postdoctoral project on it. The vastness of this plateau, it is massive, but also the vastness of unpublished graffiti makes this a research project that really is actually firstly a shared undertaking that one person can't do it, and it will also just take a long time. That's it. So it can't be wrestled into an ARC application, for example. So let me walk you through what it's like working in one of these complexes and to show you what this process of looking for graffiti looks like before expanding these findings to the plateau. So what you see here on the slide, I've pointed out the complex of an official named Mehu, who lived and died around 2300 BCE. And it's located directly south of Djoser's pyramid, if that helps you orient where we are on the plateau. This complex was first discovered by Egyptian archaeologist Saqqara in 1939 and is the current subject of a forthcoming study by the Oxford expedition to Egypt, led by Dr. Yvonne Harper, actually also a Kiwi, by the way. When I first joined the OE season in 2018, I was still a doctoral student in Oxford, and Yvonne I was really grateful to Yvonne for allowing me to join their work as a photography assistant for herself and Paolo Scremin, who's not an Egyptologist, but is one of the most incredible photographers working in Egypt now. So I was able to develop some of my own methods for recording graffiti, and I'm really excited that I'll be returning to join their work for the first time in November since 2018, because I finished my PhD and then there was COVID, and then I relocated internationally twice. So I haven't actually returned to do work with them since then. Graffiti are often found in overlooked. There we go. Graffiti are often found in overlooked places. Exterior walls, so literally the outside walls of a monument, the door jambs and paving slabs on the floor, or the painted or otherwise unsculpted areas within these monuments like the dado. So I've pointed this out here on the slide. This is what we call the dado. Notice that it's painted black, but it doesn't appear that there's any sculpted relief like what we see here at eye level height. All of these areas, even the floor of these monuments, were actually possible writing or drawing surfaces for the Egyptians. They didn't actually carry lots of paper around with them. Papyrus was also really expensive. Most writing surfaces were just what was available to them, and they would actually use walls as writing surfaces. But it's also important to stress that lightly scratched graffiti and faded dipinti, so those painted marks, are also really easy to miss when observing a surface under diffuse light. So this is light that's hitting the surface directly at it, so you don't get a lot of shadow. And this is where the natural or artificial. Also, the nature of photographic and epigraphic recording in Egyptology often means that work is centered around here, right, at eye level. This is where all the sculpted, painted stuff is, which is what Egyptologists tend to be the most interested in. And I show these photos here from one of the interior rooms, so you get a sense of actually the challenges of working in these environments. Very high ceilings, very narrow passageways. You kind of start to get a sense of why the graffiti is sort of missed a little bit. There's so much to look at. So you have to be looking for the graffiti really specifically and intentionally to actually find it. The tools used to make these inscriptions were varied, and this is really exciting avenue for future work, something I'll come back to at the end. Although a number of New Kingdom graffiti or painted inscriptions like the one I showed earlier are painted, most of the graffiti that I work on are in fact scratched, really sort of like carved into the limestone. So it seems that scribal tools like a reed brush or ink are not used, and instead we have to imagine other sharp objects like a copper chisel or a chip of flint, whatever sharp thing was at hand. And actually, having done some experimental archaeology courtesy of colleagues at the Chowchat Wing, limestone's actually like butter from this place. You can actually really carve into it. You don't actually need a super sharp tool to carve into the limestone, which is really interesting. I'm not sure if you can use a reed brush. I haven't done that yet, but I'd actually really like to see if you could use a reed brush to also carve into limestone, but that's a possibility. The physical characteristics of these inscriptions. So I know it's a little hard to see for those of us here in the room, but there's a scratched graffiti. I hope you can see it here. It says the overseer Khai, that's what the name is. So he's just, this guy scratched his name sort of next to these two figures. This is what that scene looks like with diffuse light, right? Just coming in from the hallway. You can't really see the scratches at all. But this is what it's like when you rake light across, the graffiti that comes up. And I've shown this video here. I'll play it again. Hope people on Zoom can see this okay. So pausing there, notice how you can see lots of scratchy marks, but you can't really see anything that looks like text. This is tiny as well, right? So this person's foot would probably be like, I don't know, a centimeter, a couple of centimeters, like really tiny. And I want you all to focus your eyes here, just underneath the foot, because when you rake light across it, a little inscription pops up, right? Another name and a title, a priest. So that's the sort of work that's required, the attention to the wall that's required to actually find even these textual inscriptions. They're really tiny. They're all hieroglyphic, right? So difficult to date them, but they are absolutely pharaonic inscriptions. They're in hieroglyphic Egyptian. A lot of them are names, and some of the names are of people that are actually named elsewhere in the tomb. So we get a sense of people actually coming quite specifically to this place to leave their marks. As a result of this, I found graffiti that have been missed in earlier studies of the monument, and especially those in undecorated areas. And this is another example that I published a little article about, in the Egyptian Archaeology magazine, with photos of Yvonne and Paolo on the cover. So this is a name, again, it's very scratched and light, but this is the name Teti Ankh, which is again an official who's named elsewhere in the tomb. He scratched his name just in the doorway jamb here, just close to the entrance of the tomb. So it's like he's come in, he's actually named on a wall just here, and he's added his name to the door jamb, assuming that the person in the scene and the writer are the same. I've included this slide actually, even though it takes me a little bit of setup to get there, but this is what a 3D model of this tomb looks like. It was made by Egyptian colleagues in 2018, and it's really helpful for getting a sense of what these spaces are like. I'd really encourage you, if you're studying Egyptian history, to really look for these 3D models on Matterport. just to get a sense of what these monuments feel like when you walk inside them. But for my work, looking at graffiti, what you can't see, because the resolution of the photographs is not high enough, if you zoom in on this door jamb, you can't see the graffito at all. So even with these sort of new photographic technologies, you still have to be looking really specifically for the graffiti to know to record it. So we're in a bit of a bind, basically. The technology is really helpful for some things, but it doesn't actually advance us necessarily for recording graffiti. Okay, so those are some of the challenges for recording graffiti in situ, and I can't wait to go back in a few months and find some more. But during COVID and more recently, I've also been pivoting to other avenues because it's actually also really difficult to find graffiti in existing publications, but it's possible. And in fact, this work started when I was still a student in Aotearoa, working on this on my master's thesis, and I found graffiti in the photographs of other published monuments. I didn't know that this was going to turn into a massive project at the time, but that was the origin of it. A student in Aotearoa who'd never actually been to Egypt yet, that was how I got really excited in graffiti. I've also been looking at archives, and particularly the archive of Batascope Gunn, who was one of these early 20th century excavators, also a professor of Oxford, whose notes are in the Griffith Institute at the University of Oxford. He actually recorded a huge amount of graffiti, but it was never published, just because it was seen at the time as being, I don't know, not as exciting as the other more fancy formal stuff. So his archive is fantastic because he actually made a huge number of notes and took photographs, or worked with Egyptian photographers to take photographs of lots of mason's marks. I promise you these are mason's marks. You're probably like, what is that, Julia? This is a block of stone, and these marks here this is actually an upside down painted inscription near one of the pyramids in the Teti Pyramid Cemetery where I work. Graffiti are also found, and this is, if you have a chance to go to any of these museums in the US, some of you might have actually been to these museums, graffiti are also found in great quantities on monuments and relief blocks, now displaced in global museums. This example here in Massachusetts from the Worcester Art Museum is one of 70 blocks that are distributed across 18 museums around the world. This is also one of the sad things about what's happened with these Egyptian monuments in the last sort of 100 years, is they've been distributed and displaced, which means obviously we get the chance to see them even in places like Australia, but it sort of splits the monument up across 18 museums, which makes it really difficult to in fact study the monument as a whole. But this is an example of a block in the Worcester Art Museum where there's all this graffiti on the block. Some of it is pharaonic and some of it is later. And this is an example in the Met, the tomb of Per-Neb, where very small marks, a little head here, a little hieroglyphic sign, which is a little tea loaf, are also found on the blocks. And then graffiti from parts of monument, which are actually still in situ in Saqqara, but part of it is in a different museum, also have graffiti. So this is an example of the chapel of Akhenaten, which is in the Louvre in Paris. So the interior part of the chapel is in Paris, the outside of the monument still in Saqqara. And look, there's all this figural graffiti on the outside of the monument. So if you're trying to produce a publication that put the graffiti back in its context, you actually have to do both. You have to look at the stuff that's in a museum overseas. You also have to very carefully study the monument, the bits of the monument that were left by excavators and are still in situ. And this is a monument that I've also studied myself quite extensively. And one of the largest clusters of graffiti that I've worked on comes from this family tomb complex of Merowica, again from about the same time as Mehu, 2300 BCE. He was married to the eldest daughter of King Teti, whose pyramid is just here, right? So important guy, here he is, big cheese. This monument's actually been published 3 times, including by my colleagues at Macquarie University about 15 years ago. But in fact, the outside walls of the monument, some of it's reconstructed, but there are original casing blocks here on the lower courses. They hadn't actually been properly photographed. And here's what I found when I studied the outside walls looking for figural graffiti. A huge number of figural compositions. I won't go through them, just in the interest of time, I won't go through it in lots of detail, but we have lions, which is a motif that also appears elsewhere in Saqqara. We have falcons, including a falcon wearing a crown, which means it sort of represents one of the falcon deities, possibly Horus Behedity, who was worshipped in this area. And then we even have, trust me that on this is a little mongoose. It has a long tapering tail, it has a small body, it isn't like a lion and it's not like a dog. And in fact, there's a representation of a mongoose inside this tomb. So we even have possible image reference to things that are located nearby. And graffiti makers, it's not that they're necessarily going into the tomb and they're making a mongoose. I'm not assuming a direct transmission like that, but just to sort of say the images that you find in the graffiti here are also images that are found nearby in these cemetery spaces. What we can also sort of say generally about the graffiti here is that people are returning again and again and again to make their marks. And this is something I find really, really interesting. And a final sort of like example before I turn to some methodological problems is this category of graffiti, which is found across the Saqqara Plateau and actually throughout temples in Egypt. And these are carved game boards, right? Has everyone heard of the game Senet? Have you heard of some people? Yes, have heard of the game Senet. It's kind of like ancient Egyptian backgammon. So these little Senet boards are carved into the floors of monuments, including these Old Kingdom tombs that I work on in the Teti Pyramid Cemetery. They're often found near doorways, and this suggests that they're placed there because of the access to natural light. That's an important factor. And it also suggests that they're actually used by visitors, right? So it's placed near a natural light point because you're actually going to sit there and play some Senet. They each contain a grid made up of 30 squares arranged in rows of 10. This is typically characteristic of a Senet board and not another ancient known game, although Roman temples throughout Egypt actually have lots of different types of game boards. In this cemetery, it's really specifically Senet, so we can assume it probably has a sort of pharaonic date, even though that still puts us in the realm of like 3,000 years. Players would have brought their own pieces to use in playing the game, and some of the examples actually have little tallies nearby, which suggests that people are returning to the same point, a few times, and they keep playing with their colleagues. The speech captions that accompany these scenes of playing Senet and Old Kingdom tombs really give us a sense of what this might have sounded like as well. I'm really interested in these sort of sonic and oral qualities. So this one here from the Metropolitan Museum of Art is "Lift it up, hurry up, you fool," in the 6th Dynasty tomb of Memphis. It's been tentatively suggested that some of these graffiti and the playing of Senet somehow had a ritual purpose, but I'm actually not really convinced of this interpretation. I would suggest that the fact that they're placed near doorways suggests that they're used by workers, and we know that workers were coming to these cemeteries to actually perform cult ritual. So even though there's ritual happening in the space, it's being performed by workers, and these might be the people that are actually playing Senet. That's sort of the interpretation I'm quite fond of right now. All right, so who do we think was actually making graffiti in Saqqara? Given that existing scholarship on graffiti from Memphis really focuses on textual and especially the hieratical cursive Egyptian graffiti, you would be forgiven for thinking that graffiti was largely the work of scribes, like these dudes shown here. Look how fancy they are. They've got fancy scribal palettes, fancy pens, they're looking pretty fancy, they're doing a lot of writing. So you'd be forgiven for thinking that that's it, those are our writers. But some people working in Saqqara might not have worked as scribes, but also possessed an ability to write, even in a functional sense. And that might have been actually part of their work. But the vast majority of graffiti are in fact figural graffiti, not textual inscriptions. And that might tell us something about variable degrees of literacy, including visual literacy, remembering that this is a visual language. It isn't just one that has an alphabet and that you produce text with. One thing I'd caution here is equating images and figural productions solely with a lack of literacy. So I just want to make it clear that I'm not equating those two things, only that I want to expand who's doing writing. That's the point here. It's not that figural stuff means you're not literate, but expanding who is doing writing to include not just scribes. That's the point. We need to dispense with the image, probably, which Egyptologists have tended to perpetuate, of graffiti being made by scribes holding their scribal palettes. As I mentioned earlier, we have to imagine graffiti being made with other sharp objects, right? Like a little copper chisel. Here's an example from the Old Kingdom shown here, also in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Oh, sorry, more Middle Kingdom, it's from Lisht. Or chips of flint, right? So anything sharp that was at hand. And these are actually all objects that can be found in abundance in the area of Saqqara and Memphis. One of the reasons graffiti are so significant to our conception of writer and reader is that they offer glimpses of a diverse community of writing users who range from fully to functionally literate. I'd use the word writing user to draw particular attention to the actions of writing and drawing in the graffiti making process, but also its materiality. So that writing or drawing is an embodied physical practice associated with a range of objects and skills, and not just those of scribes. And then attention to this how-ness of writing and drawing brings us a little closer to the ancient and modern bodies that made these marks. Scratches and gouges and carved lines represent hands and bodies making dramatic and forceful gestures, especially when we compare the act of scratching an inscription versus painting one. Your body is actually doing a completely different thing. It also sounds really different. So these are sort of important considerations when we're trying to imagine what making graffiti was like in ancient Memphis. The precise gestures of writing, we can only really hypothesize. This is where some of this new experimental archaeology is actually really fun. And I only just had the experience recently of trying to chisel my own graffiti into some limestone. And I was really surprised to see how easy it was, right? The limestone just sort of fell away underneath I was using a metal tool. It's a replica that was made by my colleague Martin Odler, who really studies these copper tools. But I was really surprised at how easy it was to actually just scratch an inscription, just like the one that I showed you earlier of the overseer Chai. It was really easy to replicate that inscription. So where I'm going with all of this is thinking about inscriptions this way actually helps us locate them better on the ancient monuments. If we're not just assuming that everything's going to be textual, we're not assuming that everything's going to be at eye height, we suddenly find graffiti everywhere, and that's what's really exciting. In many cases, the graffiti I've shown in this talk remain to us pretty stubborn and pretty silent, and we don't know precisely who made them or why. Even when we have a name, we don't necessarily know why are they coming to add their name. We can gesture it, we can guess, but very, very rarely do the inscriptions actually tell us why they're there. The Headnut to Parnakh inscription is actually really exceptional for that reason. But to exclude this vast quantity of graffiti that cover the ancient walls of Memphis, whether the figural marks or the Arabic inscriptions, is in my opinion a mistake, and that's the opinion shared by some of my colleagues who also work on graffiti in this area. These are what James Elkins, who's an art historian, has called shimmering things at the edge of analysis, and they belong to a long and ancient tradition of graffiti making in built natural environments, the production of which has filled the Memphite landscape with sounds and signs of people's presence. And through the graffiti, we can learn just a little bit more about some of the people who lived and worked in Memphis. Even though we've lost their town, the town is lost to us archaeologically largely, we can start to think a little bit more about what was their day like? What did it sound like when they played Senate? You know, why did they go to that particular tomb to carve a Senate board and not another one? Those are the sort of things that we can start thinking about. Not just in the 3rd millennium BCE, but in the thousands of years that also came after this period as people continue to walk the paths and tracks through this very ancient place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was fascinating. And we do have plenty of time for questions.
I did okay with time.
Oh, yeah.
I did cut out a little bit in the middle because I was like worried about not getting to the end.
No, very well done. I might start us off. So this is a very profound question, but with the Senate boards, do we think that they were, provided by temple officials, or is it a matter of, friends coming together and, I'd really like to play some Senate. Okay, well, let's carve out a board on a block?
I do think it's the latter. I mean, we do know that, so in some of the temples, I didn't show examples from temples specifically, but from some of the temples at Saqqara and South Saqqara worked on by the French currently, and also some of the Middle Kingdom temples, they actually have like hundreds of Senate boards, hundreds in a temple area, which also gives you a sense of how many workers might have been using this space. And it's not that all the boards might have been at play at the same time, but I don't think anyone has yet quite done a spatial mapping of like how many players could sit at all the boards yet, but people are starting to get really interested in this. So some of it is about temple officials, but others it does seem to be workers that had other reasons for coming up to the cemetery. I think in some of these tombs, for example, we know that there was like a cult, so that the above ground part of the tomb seems to be semi-public. There's instructions on the outside that like, you've got to be purified, you've got to be a dude usually. But in practice, it seems actually lots of people could go into those places. So there's like the real and the ideal, the ideal and the real, basically, with these tomb spaces. And the Senate boards, I think, seem to show us that there were all of these informal practices that seem to happen around the world that was happening. seemed to be a place to pass the time. A similar argument's actually been made for like the scribal graffiti, like of Hednut and Parnut, that this was actually about getting out of the sun. As I was saying, it's hot and dry and dusty. It was hot and dry and dusty also in like second millennium BCE. And so part of this was about getting out of the sun. It's not that they're not there to appreciate the place, because they literally say we're here to come see the temple of Djoser. But the reason for being in that corner, in that place, might have been also like a pragmatic one. Got to get out of the sun. So I don't know if that actually answered your question, Brian.
We have Rebecca then. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for that talk, Shu. That's absolutely excellent. I've got two questions for you. One might sort of answer the other one, but when it comes to the graffiti inside the buildings and inside the actual the temples and the tombs and everything else, do we know if this was something done by the workers while they were working, or is this sort of like later on after everything's finished, new visitors coming in and defacing the tombs, so to speak? Or is it more like possibly the actual workers on break scribbling over what is realistically their own piece of work?
That's such a good question. There's actually so much been written about that, because trying to work out when were things being made, even actually what we call the primary decoration, is not really worked out by Egyptologists. We don't even know exactly how long it took to make a tomb. There's some really interesting studies that have gone into this, but the Egyptians don't tell us really in any great detail how long it took them to make a tomb, at least in the Old Kingdom. The New Kingdom is a little bit different. The textual sources around that are a little richer, and so we sort of understand, like, here's how many weeks and days it took to make something. So in the Old Kingdom, it's really difficult to work out like exactly what you've just asked. But what I think it's a bit of both. So I think some marks are about this is something I'm doing while I'm working on something else. Others I think are more a type of visitor's inscription, right? Which can be attached to work, remembering that this is also a cult place. So you've got the work of making the tomb, and then there's the work of the tomb being a functioning cult place with rituals attached to it. And the Egyptians loved rituals, right? So these tombs, they had daily and weekly offerings on like certain festivals. Festivals were a big deal. So they had lots of reasons to be going and coming back to the same place. How I sort of hinted at they might be returning to the same place again and again. They actually had a reason for doing that. So to answer your question, it's really tricky to actually tell with any certainty, but I think both is happening.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
A second question was with the same sort of the artwork, the figurative stuff more so than anything else inside the tombs or on places where there is, shall we say, official primary imagery also happening. How do we know what's graffiti and what's not, say, a false start or a sketch or actual mistakes being made during the primary work in comparison?
Great question. I love that question as well. Sometimes it's about location. So especially when it's like low down in the, it could be practicing for something. And I've thought about this idea. I've given a couple of papers where I've shown some of the I showed you the nice figural graffiti where it looks like things. There's lots of graffiti where it's like, it sort of looks like half of a thing. And you're like, is it a practice? So maybe not a false start, but is it practicing? Or is it someone copying another artist? And there are absolutely examples of that. So to answer your question, I think there are examples of all of those things. Not so sure about false starts. They tend to, in the primary relief, you can see that. In the primary relief area, that's not really graffiti, but you can see false starts. Because there's usually 3 different teams of workers. There's a draftsperson, there's a sculptor, there's a painter, there's a scribe. And we have to imagine teams of these people working in this space. And they aren't all doing the same job. Some of them might have been able to do multiple jobs, but there were different stages of work. So you can break the production down a little bit like that. And the graffiti seems to be separate to that. But you can see those other types of marks, and I'm really interested in them as well. I don't call them graffiti, but I do think they're part of the mark making process that's happening as they're decorating these spaces. It's a great question.
Wonderful, thank you.
Well, Rebecca just asked something I was going to ask.
Oh, great, yeah.
I was interested in your observations about how they've been carved.
Yeah.
So while it might not tell us who is carving, does it tell us who isn't? Does it tell us
Absolutely.
So they didn't have their tools taken off them at the end of the day.
No, exactly,
So they have.
exactly right. Interestingly, some of the inscriptions where they use the title scribe, I love these ones because sometimes they're the ones that have lots of mistakes in them. There's a really great example in one of the tombs where it's a scratched little thing. So it's different to a carved, I'm going to use this word formal, but please understand that I'm not saying graffiti can't be that. There's fully carved relief of a scribe in his name. The graffito of the same name, he actually misorients some of the signs because Egyptian can be written in like 4 different ways. So it's not necessarily a mistake, but there's a flexibility in the graffito that isn't found in the primary relief, which is really interesting as well. And you can see other things, like sometimes signs that are a mixture of the cursive script and the fully hieroglyphic ones. They're sometimes mixing scripts, which is also really interesting. That speaks to variable levels of literacy and not in a negative way, right? And a person who is trained in both forms of the script, the hieroglyphic formal one and the more cursive day-to-day administrative one. And then you've got, the figural stuff where it could also be by scribes, but we don't know.
Could it be by children? When you see those pictures that you showed when you were talking about the mongoose. And
I've wondered that. I think they're quite high from the ground for it to be true. It could be younger people though, absolutely. I mean, children were workers in ancient Egypt. Some of my work actually on girls suggests that girls started working at 5 years old, for example. We have that evidence in other pre-industrial societies. So the quality of them potentially being childlike might actually indicate a child worker, but I think it's really hard to tell just from the graffito. And the other problem with height and size, so the textural graffitos has a much clearer author. For the figural stuff, what's really tricky is the sand sometimes banks up. And we have graffiti that are sometimes really high up. Exactly. Yeah. So it's like you have to think about it from 50 different angles. And the combination of them can really change who the author might be, right? But yeah, it's an idea I've thought about in terms of them not necessarily being children, the images not being the thing that tells us it's a child, but just including child writers and workers in this sort of, exactly. Yeah, great question.
Your own observation about actually doing it makes it sound like it can be done more quickly than
exactly. I hadn't always thought about it that way. I'd thought about it as taking a long time. And it was really great having the chance to actually carve some limestone myself because I was like, oh, it's actually really fast. We can do this in a few minutes. But it does make a really particular scratchy sort of sound. So again, it contributes to this picture of Memphis being a place. We tend to, the way it's sometimes pictured is like this very solemn, austere, lots of ritual, blah, blah, blah. All those things happened. It also was constantly noisy, right? Just like a construction site today. Fewer cranes.
I think we got time for one more question. Michelle has her hand up in the Zoom.
Yes, hi. Thanks so much, Julia. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. You can all hear me, right?
Yes, can hear you fine.
Yeah, okay. I was just wondering sort of idly, I think I remember hearing you say that there's even graffiti from like quite recent, like what was it the First World War or some of
Yes.
I think you said Australian soldiers or something like that.
So you're really interested in that particular,
No, I don't work with Egyptology or graffiti or anything at all. But I'm just curious because is that the sort of the newest graffiti, so to speak? Because I kind of wonder what happens, like, further down the track, say 50 years down the track, and even yourself, like you're doing work there.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of other workers there as well, sort of workers. Sorry, I did. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, I don't expect you are, and you feel free to say that's no, absolutely, totally not allowed. But are you leaving your own marks?
So I'm not myself, but actually I'm really interested in the modern graffiti. I've taken a lot of photographs of it. The modern graffiti in Arabic and other languages is absolutely present in Saqqara. It is now illegal to make graffiti on Egyptian monuments. So there is a law now. So it is from a modern Egyptian perspective, it would be considered defacement.
Yeah.
But interestingly, there was a great film in the 1970s that showed these very famous Egyptian actors going to a replica sort of Memphite site and carving their names in a heart. I've forgotten the name of the film now, but all of my Egyptian colleagues know this film, and it was so famous because there was outrage. There's a real practice of making modern graffiti, and even in one of the pyramids that I've worked in, the Pyramid of Unis, which I didn't talk about in this talk, has an Arabic graffiti with a date 1970 in Arabic, right?
Wow.
So some of the graffiti still includes a name and a date, and I find that stuff fascinating too. So even though now it's prohibited and it is considered defacement, and in fact it happened very recently, and it was it was a real uproar about this defacement that was made in one of the tombs, Meroruka, that I showed on the slides. Is you can find this on the internet if you just Google, defacement of the tomb of Meroruka. I think it even just happened last year. So there's a real shift. There's an attitude shift in how we think about graffiti. We sort of look at the 1915 stuff and this kind of like, oh, haha, like how lovely is it that the Australian Imperial Force wrote their names in pencil, because it's a mark of their presence there. But now we have a really different attitude to it. I find all the graffiti fascinating. All of it fascinating. There is also, by the way, I don't have a photo of it yet. There is in fact a kangaroo.
Oh wow!
In Abu. So and my Czech colleagues who work there have taken photographs of it. So I don't think that it has actually been published in an article in German, but there's no sort of accessible publication that I know of that actually shows this sort of drawing of a kangaroo. But yeah, I just to sort of answer your question, Michelle, I'm actually really interested in the modern graffiti. I don't myself make it because it is actually illegal now, but I still study it because I still consider it honestly to be part of this practice. So I try not to attach a value judgment to it, and more again think about it more as belonging to this practice and how people are using these monuments, and leave it to others to assign a value judgment to it.
That's fabulous. Yeah.
Oh,
I guess, sorry, just one last comment about that, I guess. And I can totally understand why they've passed a law and made it sort of, illegal, and they consider it defacement these days. But I can see the loss as well, because if you're not leaving marks now, then in 50, 100 years, 500 years, no one can tell that you've been there,
It's interesting you say that, and maybe this will be the last thing I say. I'll try to say it quickly, but I totally get where you're coming from, Michelle. Another way of thinking about this might be, though, that we have other methods of documenting our presence now, right? Think about TikTok, think about photographs. I actually think we have other ways of recording our presence. So, and I'm not saying we think about them like graffiti, but maybe if we step away from thinking about it as loss in that way. I know exactly what you're saying, but if we think about actually our visits to these sites and ours have been documented in a way that has never been possible before. So I'm not sure it will be forgotten.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I think I was too focused on sort of
the graffiti. But that's great. I love the comment. Thank you. It was really great.
Thank you so much. I shan't take up any more. Thanks,
Michelle.
Thanks.
Well, we are a little over time, so we might wrap it up there. And please join me in thanking Julia one more time. Excellent. So Kai's gone from the chat, so you might want to respond.
Kai's one of my students, so I'll write to them.
But before we go, just a reminder, we will be meeting again same time next week, where Effie Karageorgis and Catherine Colburn will be talking about their work on aftercare and mental health, part of their discovery project. So do come and join us next week. And in the meantime, have a great week, and we'll see you around.